morning, everybody, and welcome to Locker Talk, a webcast series brought to you by BreachLock, a global leader in offensive security solutions, offering continuous attack surface discovery, penetration testing, and red teaming. Hi, I'm Ann Chesbro, and I will be your moderator and host today. Today's webcast is all about DORA and other new regulations and their impact on penetration testing. Faced with increasing risks posed by the expanding threat landscape, the Digital Operational Actor, DORA, is a major piece of EU legislation that was introduced impacting financial entities such as banks and credit institutions, with a focus on security testing as an essential aspect of the regulation. Since its introduction, other directives have been introduced, such as the NIS2 directive and the National Cybersecurity Center Framework Update. In this webcast, viewers will learn more about DORA from our guest speaker, who will be introduced shortly, and how DORA has raised the level of digital resilience in the financial sector, the challenges facing CISOs and their security teams, and how to adhere to DORA's new mandate with an emphasis on red teaming and the role DORA's threat-led penetration testing plays in compliance. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to go over just a few logistics. If you have any questions during the discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try to answer them. We will also take some time at the end of the webcast to take questions from our audience. Lastly, today's webcast is being recorded live and will be made available on demand at breachlock.com after this live airing. Now I am excited to introduce our guest speaker. Our guest speaker and technical expert today is Vishal Verma. Vishal is the Vice President of Pen Testing Solutions for BreachLock. He is a seasoned professional with over 20 years of experience in information security and governance, risk management, and compliance solutions implementation. Before joining BreachLock, he worked for blue-chip companies like IBM, Ernst & Young, and Deloitte in defensive and offensive security, and in consultant, auditor, and architect roles. He is a certified professional with credentials that include project management, information system security, and cloud security. He is an Archer Certified Associate and a Certified Payment Industry Security Implementer, as well as ISO Certified. Welcome, Vishal, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Anne. Pleasure to be here.
And with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Vishal, who will be talking to us about DORA, other regulations, and how it impacts penetration testing. Thanks, Vishal.
Sure. Thank you so much, Anne. So, as the current webcast is primarily focusing on DORA and other pen testing regulations that makes an impact in how pen testing is being perceived by the organization, right? So let's take a look at it, right? So once we, all right. Right. So 2024 has seen new regulations, right, which are being dictating very stringent requirements for penetration testing across several sectors, right? And these directives and regulations have majorly impacted how pen testing is being perceived by the organizations. Earlier, as more like a one-time activity, but now, as Anne said in the introduction, right, now the paradigm has shifted more towards threat-led penetration testing, right, which requires and have more broader comprehensive overview of the risk and threats an organization may face, right? So if you look at the regulations that are being brought in 2024 that has a major impact on pen testing, first is DORA, right? So the EU's Digital Operational Resiliency Act, DORA, right, which is becoming enforceable in 2025, January or early 2025, right, mandates a threat-led penetration testing to be done at every 3 years, right, for the financial institutes, which primarily focuses on critical infrastructure resiliency and proactive threat management, right? And DORA's TLPT, that's threat-led penetration testing requirements, are stringent and enforces more like red team, blue team, purple teaming kind of assessments, which require an active assessment of incident response planning and counter-identified threats as well, right? Moving forward, the GLBA requirements, right? The GLBA regulation comes into cybersecurity world for financial institutes, right? And the updates that are currently introduced to GLBA mandates annual pen testing and semi-annual vulnerability assessments for the institutions, right? And it also mandates hands-on pen testing rather than more, I would say, the previously conceived or preconceived view of automated testing. But this update basically kind of enforces hands-on testing, wherein the tester attempts to circumvent the organization defenses through real-world attacks, right, rather than relying on automated scans. Again, more inclination towards threat-led penetration testing, right? The other one that we see is EU's Cyber Resiliency Act, right? This also kind of focuses more onto the penetration testing of critical vulnerabilities or identifying critical vulnerabilities in the supply chain, right? The NIS2 directive, again, an EU regulation, which is expanded upon the previous version, or let's say its predecessor of 2016 version, which talks again about the resiliency and the operational resiliency of essential sectors, right? And this basically updates, I would say, bolster cybersecurity resilience across region, right? Wherein the implications for organizations which are operating into the international world gets impacted, right? So those are the regulations which basically kind of have an impact on the pen testing requirements. But we also need to understand some of the drivers behind these regulatory updates, right? If we talk about the drivers in principle, first one is the rising threat and sophistications of the cyber attack, right? The expansion of the digital and the cloud services coming into play, the growing security implications and obligations for our clients to be served upon, right? And customers' trust and global compliance requirements, right? So these are the primary drivers that we will start to kind of delve into as we move forward in the discussion here, right? So as the discussion is primarily focused on DORA, so let's take a look at the components of DORA, right? So DORA primarily is being made into two major components. One is the digital operational resiliency testing, that's DORT, and the TLPT, that's the threat-led penetration testing, right? So if we look into the two aspects of DORA primarily, one aspect focuses more onto the continuous pen testing, which makes sure the entirety of the organization and the attack surface or the IT components are secure, wherein the other component complements the first one into more threat-led penetration testing or more threat vectors or attack surface or attack vectors based onto it, right? So if I talk about the DORT, digital operational resilience testing, that's where it mandates the entities regulated under DORA or exposed to DORA to carry out at least an annual pen test for all their systems and their supporting critical infrastructure, right? On the contrary, the TLPT, threat-led penetration testing, is mandatory for the financial industries or financial entities, right, which needs to undergo real-world attack simulations, right? That's where the TTPs start to come into play. The scenario-based penetration testing starts to come into play, but the requirement is to be assessed and satisfied on at least every 3-year basis, right? As we move forward, right? So if I look into the common challenges, this is where it starts to kind of boil down that how the organizations are being impacted with the introduction of these regulations and the regulatory frameworks coming into play, right? And when we interact with a lot of our clients, C-suits and executive, right, we see approximately more than 50% of the organizations that we on a day-to-day basis interact with faces one or the other challenges to comply with the requirements that are set forth by DORA, right? And a survey basically shows that approximately 60% of the financial institutes within the EU region are going to get impacted with the advance or let's say the introduction of DORA standards to maintain their operational resiliency and security, right? So I'll take a step back here and look into the perspective of the clients that we currently deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? The first question, basis the introduction of DORA and other regulatory requirements coming into play, and the clients have in their mind is that how can we perform so many tests on so many assets all across the perimeters that they have, right? Across different industries and segments that they deal with, how they can repeat these activities in a fashion that they can have a continuous assessment throughout the year, right? DORA basically kind of mandates all these requirements as mandatory, and it is coming right around the corner to be implemented in effect, right? Other questions that come across and we hear across a lot is, how do we streamline this exercise, right? These kind of exercises that we have to do pen test on, and how do we automate the process? How can we centralize the results that we can consume as an organizations to work towards the overall goal of achieving DORA, or having a very overall cyber secure aware or cyber secure digital posture that we have, right? And the primary question, or let's say everything starts to kind of boil down, is without blowing up our security budgets, because the budgets are seeing cut downs when the requirements are being more stringent in nature, that requires more and more cohesive approach for an organizations to start look into overall security posture and make more security aware decisions as well, right? So first thing that we take a look at is the scalability of the security testing, right? So how can we scale the security testing requirements? Because if you look at the human-led pen test, right, or the penetration testing requirements set forth by DORA or any other industry regulations, talking about scenario based, talking about threat based vectors as well, right? But it is very important to understand that cybersecurity is not a uniform or an unvarying block, right? It is a multifarious field wherein different types of techniques and tactics come into play while making security decisions. And so does DORA does that. I would say it writes down the requirements in such a fashion that you can pick and choose from various types of tests that are being accepted under DORA Article 25, right, for security assessments. That would help you prioritize your assets, prioritize your human-led pen testing, then again feed into the threat-led pen testing, and that would overall evolve your organization as a secure organization, right? So if we talk about primarily scaling the security testing, right? So if we look at the security elements to it, human-led pen testing is a bit difficult to scale because it involves human intervention. It involves scoping related activities coming into play. But it is on the other side, it is easy to scale the automated security testing, right? And that's where DORA accepts different types of tests, be it vulnerability assessment and scans, open source analysis, gap analysis, source code reviews, even scenario based testing to an extent there, right? Or even the performance related testing and pen testing as a whole, right? So DORA gives the capability to our clients to scale their pen testing approaches, program, and procedures to an extent to meet the need of DORA, right? Second problem, or one of the biggest problem that our clients face currently, is the visibility of the attack surface, right? And another important questions that come into play is, uh, what is my attack surface, right? What are the avenues I can get attacked onto? What is open to the outside world which I'm not aware of, and that may or may not cause an attack against my organization, right? So a lot of enterprise organizations that we deal with, wherein the teams are so disjointed at times, and it becomes very cumbersome process to keep control of the attack surface, right? And an organization cannot protect what they cannot see, right? And as per the survey, 62% of the organizations have blind spot in their attack surface. And out of that 62%, the remaining only 9% of the organizations have said to have a comprehensive monitoring on the entirety of the attack surface, not just on the part of it. But if you look at the differential between 62 and then the 9%, it is a huge gap that needs to be kind of fixed in, and now being fixed via the requirements, or let's say the development of these stringent regulations and acts that are coming into play, right? Then to answer these questions, right? So as a practitioner, we do recommend a solution like CTEM, right? Continuous threat and exposure management comes into play, wherein it helps you identify your external exposures, right? Attack surface management. It helps you discover the assets, right? So that's the first step of ensuring the organization is secure. First is to discover, right? Uh, then comes down the limitation of traditional pen testing, right? The if we look at the paradigm shift between the continuous penetration testing, or let's say threat-led penetration testing, versus the traditional pen testing. It's a huge difference, right? Though penetration testing exercises or activities offers the visibility into or assessment into the overall organization security, but it differs greatly in methodology, scope, and objective of it, right? So if I talk about the differentials there and how does the paradigm shift coming into play now, is the scope and realization of testing, right? So if I talk about traditional pen testing, right, wherein the scope is often limited, focusing on very specific applications, network components, or systems that are being defined by the client, right? And which basically kind of involves more like an assessment onto vulnerabilities and configuration related issues. And it kind of lacks in providing a full spectrum of threat scenarios that can often, I would say, being attacked by a human hacker coming into play for a real world simulation or real world attacks, right? On the contrary, the requirement coming in from DORA on threat led penetration testing uses realistic threat based scenarios, right? And it often requires a mimicking of current tactics, techniques, and procedures, right? TTPs shortly being named as, of actual threat actors targeting the specific organization or the industry altogether, right? So that's what the shift starts to come in. Rather than focusing on a target asset, it is more onto an ecosystem based assessment that can lead to one vulnerability being exploited that have a very big impact on the entirety of the organization, right? The another difference or limitation that we see between the traditional pen testing and the current requirements of the penetration testing is the lack of integrations of threat intel, right? The lack of adaptation of emerging threats of known adversarial tactics and techniques, right? The continuous evolvement of different methodologies that are being exploited in the world to make sure they gain access to the systems, right? On the contrary, if we look at the threat-led penetration testing, right, which actively integrates threat intelligence, right, what does that mean? It means that the tests are informed and are kept up to date to very specific cyber threats an organization might realistically face, right, to a very specific industry altogether. And this approach helps identify the most likely ways to exploit, or the most likely ways a real attacker would exploit in the real attack, and that being, our, let's say, especially being exposed by advanced persistent threats, APTs. Then the organization can proactively fix those issues and safeguard or have their guards high, right? Another issue that we also face is the testing frequency, right? In the traditional pen testing world, we were more focused on performing a periodic assessment of the target asset, right? And the periodicity was defined by the business requirements either on an annual or a semi-annual basis, right? Which primarily gives anybody or us as security practitioners just a snapshot of the security posture at a single point in time, right? It does not span across a timeline that I can look into and see the trends in terms of security and risk that it brings to the organization, right? Wherein the current requirements are more sophisticated and it requires ongoing or repeated penetration testing, right? Especially in the highly regulated environments, maybe financials, critical infrastructure, energy and resources, right? And which basically kind of ensures the organizations to continuously adapt to the new threats that they are exposed onto and keep their guards high by improving their current defenses systems, right? Onto ensuring their overall compliance with the organization, right? Then continuous security testing, right? So how do I address the continuous security testing requirements, right? What are the result availability? Do I need to wait for the results to come in and then I can work on mitigations, right? So all these paradigms, or let's say the approach is shifted towards more real time, close to real time basis, and that's where the requirements of CTEM solutions or any other sophisticated means of including threat-led penetration testing in their current portfolio is becoming a necessity, right? And the last one is the industry expertise, right? The reputation of and the security organization performing these assessments, right? The credentials the assessor upholds, right? Also matters a lot because the requirements, what requirement in these regulations are specifically applicable to an industry or to an organization or to an entity is of paramount importance because the fines, the penalties are very heavy in this kind of the regulated environment, right? Moving forward, we understood, if I look back currently, we understood what are the changes that is being brought in by the pen testing regulations. We saw what are the bifurcations of different pen testing requirements are in these regulations. Then what are the challenges that current organizations faces, right? But if I look at the next step, once we understand the challenges, how can we achieve these requirements set forth by any other regulation, right? And this is where a lot of questions starts to come in, right? So one question basically kind of comes in as part of the step one, right? Understanding the applicability of the requirement. Does this requirement even applies to an entity or not, right? Having a very thorough understanding of the requirements is of paramount importance. That is why the industry expertise comes into play for the common challenges that we have seen earlier, right? So if the person involved in the assessment or the entity or the organization engaged with that assessment are not up to date with the requirements, they may not be able to kind of satisfy the requirements being set forth by these kind of regulations and identify the applicable components and the assessments required for those specific components to be adhered to, right? Then what are the deadlines that I need to kind of comply with these regulations, right? And as we know, DORA is coming in uh, early 2025, right? And by that time, the critical infrastructure, the critical third-party providers must align their system policies and practices with the requirement that are being set forth by DORA, right? And the key components of these risk management frameworks include the incident management requirements, right, or incident reporting protocols, digital resiliency testing or DORT that we have seen, and the TLPT, right, and third party vendor risk management. Once we move forward from step one, right, comes in step two. That's how do I identify and prioritize the assessment scope? That is where the CTEM, the visibility into the external attack surface management, starts to come into play. But that also brings in one more important questions at hand, right? So how do an organization assess, document critical third-party dependencies, right, which includes cloud services or even for outsourcing vendors, right? Currently, we have seen an advance, or let's say an upsurge or uptick into migrating into cloud infrastructure. But that inherently also brings in risk because a third party vendor is being used to host critical infrastructures or sensitive information, which basically becomes more like an inherent risk for the organization because they are again in line with their supply chain for providing any critical services or businesses, right? So that's where the third party dependency starts to come into play. And this is where again solutions like CTAM, external attack surface visibility, exposure management comes into play because you cannot protect what you cannot see, right? So that's where it starts to help identify and classify third parties and their corresponding services, right? It also helps you identify the security assessments and help prioritize and identify the risk associated to it, right? With that, you can implement an ongoing continuous security assessment. Then comes point or step three, right? Performing digital operational resiliency tests. That's more on an annual basis to identify any security issues, any security vulnerabilities, or holes that are being introduced in your environment because of the advent of the, or let's say the expansion of the digital footprint that the organization have. Emerging technologies coming into play, more sophisticated attacks coming into play. So once you gauge that, fix that, we move on to step four. That's more like performing threat-led penetration testing. And this is again, step three and four kind of overlaps with each other to an extent, wherein threat-led penetration testing also kind of feeds into what the previous infrastructure issues or previous pen testing results was. And same, the outcome of threat-led penetration testing is being fed back towards point three as well, or step three as well, right? And once we do that, we establish an ongoing or continuous security testing within the organization's environment, just to make sure they're aware of what the current risk solutions or risk postures are, and then implement and make sure those risks are addressed and are acceptable to a level that the organization currently accepts with, right? So that kind of brings me to the end of the topic here, but we'll do a quick recap. So we looked at what are the new regulations that came in 2024, and what are the impacts that they have on pen testing requirements, right? So that's where we saw the paradigm shift between the legacy pen testing and the current threat-led penetration testing. We saw the components of DORA, right? So we saw DORT and threat-led penetration testing, the different requirements being prescribed and the intention behind those different requirements, right? Then we also kind of touched upon on the common challenges that we saw as part of the implementation requirements or compliance requirements coming in from DORA, and then the corresponding steps to achieve the overall compliance that basically kind of gives our clients a more robust, more resilient, secure environment for serving their clients, right? So that's it from my end. And do you want to kind of talk about the Q&As?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Vishal. Great presentation. We do have a few questions that have come in. One you did answer, but we can certainly go over it again. But one of the questions we got from one of our audience members, actually a customer, is what existing frameworks and internal security policies align with or support DORA and its compliance efforts? For example, the NIS2 directive went into effect in October of this year.
Yeah. Right.
So
That's a great question, because whenever we see an introduction of a new regulatory framework, right, existing policies, existing framework that the organization is exposed onto comes in handy as well to kind of have an overlap and see if there are any baseline frameworks which lies underneath that requirement that can help them only add differential amount of effort to meet that requirement, right? So to answer that question, to support DORA compliance efforts, right, organization can leverage various existing security frameworks, like, and you mentioned NIS2, right? Another framework is NIST cybersecurity framework as well, right? So if I talk about that, it basically kind of set forth guidelines for managing and reducing cybersecurity risk, covering areas like risk assessment, incident response, and recovery, right? Which very heavily aligns with the requirements set forth by DORA for operational resiliency and continuous improvement. Internal policies also play a very important role, right? Because I've not seen any organization who doesn't have incident response plan, third-party risk management, or cybersecurity awareness programs, right? That again very heavily aligns with the requirements set forth by DORA, right? And you mentioned about NIS2 directive, right? So network and infrastructure system directives. It kind of mandates the requirement of cybersecurity practices, right? Having on digital service provider, which kind of very closely, and if I'm able to kind of recollect the directives from DORA as well, I would say have a very close overlap with digital resiliency and critical infrastructure components, which focuses on risk management and incident response, right? So there are various framework which acts as a baseline to DORA's requirement, but there are certain very specific requirements set forth by DORA that requires to add more, or let's say very specific focused effort by the organizations to 100% comply with the framework. I hope that answers the question.
terrific. Thank you, Vishal. We have another question that has come in, and you touched upon this, but maybe you can go into a little bit more. The question is, how should our company structure and streamline our incident reporting processes to meet DORA's requirements, including timing and data?
Mm-hmm. Right. Again, that's a great question, because when you talk about threat-led penetration testing in principle, right, that kind of focuses on touching upon actively assessing the incident response and the capabilities for recovery management as well, right, and to meet DORA's requirement for incident reporting, right. Entities need to kind of have a very structured approach and process to ensure timely, accurately responding back to the incidents and even to reporting, right. So if I'm not mistaken, there are a six-step process which kind of talks about defining the incident type and severity levels, right? Within that, if I look at very specifics, an organization need to have a structure that classify the incident, right? Whether it is a cyber attack, system outage, data breach, or disruption to the critical infrastructure or services, then the severity and the impact onto the critical operations as well, right? So that's the first piece. Second is standardized incident response workflow, right? So an organization need to have very accurate data to record the incident, right? The detection, the internal reporting, the data collection related to the forensic analysis, and then the approval process, that how the frameworks need to kind of come into play for those approvals to implement the solution, right? Then very important component which is being mandated by DORA is the timely reporting to the external authorities, right? So DORA kind of mandates the severe incidents to be reported to relevant authorities and to their respective clients within the 72 hours of detection, right? And when they confirm that it is significant. So this come into play. Implementation of incident management tools, right? So an organization need to kind of implement incident management tools for record keeping, continuous security assessments as well, right? Then documentation and record keeping, right? So any incident that needs to be kind of, I would say, registered, have to have a record against it, corresponding documentation of RCAs, and then the lessons learned, right? And the last component is training and awareness. That's the part of continuous evolvement, or let's say continuous evolution, that we as cybersecurity practitioners or organization go through, right? So if I define that, define the incident type and the severity level, set up an incident reporting workflow internal to the organization, report that timely into the authority, have incident management tools into place, perform documentation and record keeping, and then training and awareness. So
Terrific.
that's in a nutshell is how we can maintain our compliance and structure our incident management process.
Terrific. And we have one last question here, and it says, as we move into a more regulated environment, what would you say are the top priorities in order to be prepared for these changes?
Okay. So I would say that's, again, a very good question, right? Because we see these regulations coming into play day in, day out, right? We see a lot of changes as well. So as organizations, if I look at from a cybersecurity perspective, if the focus is more shifted towards securing the overall organization rather than very specifically putting efforts onto the framework, which is more like, I would say, a subset of the overall requirement that are being set forth from the, I would say, the vision of the organization to be secure, that would take down a lot of effort already to meet these specific compliance or regulatory needs for an organization, right? So if I look at the overall umbrella or overarching picture, it's more like securing the organization and then meeting these requirements automatically when they come along.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you, Vishal. And so we're getting close to time. So that concludes our webcast for today on DORA and other new regulations that impact penetration testing. I'd like to thank all of you who attended, and a big thank you to our guest speaker, Vishal Verma. Please note that this webcast will be made available on demand at breachlock.com after this airing. And if you'd like more information about BreachLock and offensive security solutions, please wait for the closing and we will provide more information on how to contact us. So thank you for joining us today.